Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Go Team Robo Go. Every now and then you do a piece that you're just super stoked about for whatever reason, and for me, this is one of them. I know that it may not be the absolute coolest thing ever, but there were a lot of things I set out to do in it that I totally did, and it was just really satisfying for me. Before it goes away, I want you to see that sketch right there of this girl's face. That was originally done as one of my reward sketches when I had a Kickstarter a few years ago for my book Pink Haired Girls. I did a bunch of sketch cards, and on one of them, I would every now and then take pictures of them, and I was going through my phone the other day and I found that headshot, and I just thought I really liked it. I wanted to try and incorporate it into something. So if you happen to be the person out there who got that sketch and you're watching this video, please let me know, because I think it's just kind of cool that years later that sketch turned into this full painting. So anyways, this was, as I said, a sketch that I found because I was just kind of mining for things to do. I actually did this a while back now. I'm trying to play catch up with all of the pieces that I've been doing and try to get the videos done. And so when I saw it, I was just like, oh, that's really cool. I was in London at the beginning of September, and so I saw these two girls when I was getting off the plane on the way back when I landed in Barcelona, and one of them had like a super baggy sweatshirt on and then like just regular jeans, and then the other one had like a big jacket, not a Letterman jacket like this, but like a big jacket that was like way oversized, and then like regular sort of skinny jeans. And I just liked that shape, and so I kept thinking to myself, like, I want to find an excuse to do something like that. And that was the entire inspiration. I found the head sketch, I saw those two girls, I liked that shape, and then I thought, let's do that. Let's do sort of like a skinny girl in a big coat. And then all the other decisions that kind of came off of that were just randomly decided at the time based on preference or whatever. That's how this piece came to be. Before we continue, I should also apologize for my voice. I'm a little under the weather, but I've had no time to get these videos together lately, so that's another part of this. Like, sorry it's taken so long to get some stuff done. After I got back from THU, I was just super busy trying to play catch up and get back into the swing of regular life, because being at THU is definitely not like being at regular life. And I just had a spare moment because I'm not feeling very well, and my wife took the kids for like a walk, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna at least get one video done real quick, and then I can rest for a few days. And so if my voice is really bad, I apologize. Maybe I should wait until my voice is better, but I feel like I'm good enough to at least crank out one of these. So now that all that bullshit's out of the way, let's get back to talking about the piece. This is actually a really long time lapse. When I'm working with the turpentine brush, there's a lot more strokes that have to be made than when it's sort of like rock solid flats in order to fill the space. I could technically use fill tools and things like that, but I want to make sure that if I try to keep it smooth, but if the texture happens, I just kind of let it happen. And because of that, it means that I have to do a lot more sort of scratching to get everything filled in solid, and then take into account those little happy accidents here or there. So it actually generates a much longer time lapse, because obviously each stroke you do will increase the length of your time lapse. So this time lapse raw, once exported, was something like 16 minutes long, which, by the way, I've seen a lot of people online, they say something like, oh, an exported Procreate time-lapse means the piece took this long to do, or whatever. Aside from the fact that it's sort of irrelevant to find out how long it took people to do things, that's not at all true. You can't take the time-lapse and reverse engineer how long it took the person to do the art, because theoretically you could just tap at the screen like a million times really fast, and just like, that's maybe how you do your art, and it'll generate a longer time-lapse. So just don't worry about that kind of stuff. I mean, don't even worry about trying to figure out how long it took someone to do something, or have them prove how long it took someone to do. If you're just sort of generally curious because maybe you're starting out and you're wondering if you're taking too much time or too little time, you can have like a nice conversation about it. But I would frame it that way. I'm trying to figure out how long it should take me to do something like this. How long did it take you? Like that type of thing. I see a lot of people that try to get like weirdly accusatory around how long things take, and that's just not a really constructive conversation to have. It doesn't really do anybody any good. So trying to sort of super sleuth out how long it takes people to do these pieces, don't worry about that. Don't use the time lapse as evidence for it. Since I'm on the topic of internet folks and the way those discourses can sometimes go, I recently joined a Procreate group on Facebook, just to sort of interact more and try to see what some other people were producing and everything. And something that's really struck me has been how people talk about art and how people talk about what gets posted there, as well as, for instance, like how maybe somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience professionally creating art talks about art. People get really hung up on a lot of like little petty things, and it drives me crazy. I'm actually on the verge of leaving that group, because not because anything's ever been directed at me. People have been super nice to me on there, except for one guy, but I'll save that for another time. But when people start having conversations around things should be this way or they should be that way, or sometimes even the opposite, like I can do whatever I want, it's art, like that type of stuff, like none of that is really helpful. I think at the end of the day, everybody just needs to remember that like everyone has a different path through their art, everyone has a different purpose for doing their art, and really it's less about saying like this is right, this is wrong, or whatever, and more about asking the artist what they're trying to accomplish and then trying to give like helpful feedback to try and get them there. Because just feedback for feedback's sake, or hey, I see you're working on something, here's some feedback, like that's not really helpful. That's why whenever somebody messages me and says, hey, could you look at my work and give me some feedback, I always ask them what they're looking to improve on, what kind of feedback are they looking for, is there some specific piece or some specific part of a piece that they'd like me to take a look at. Because the idea of giving somebody just generic feedback, there's going to be some things in that are objective, but there's also going to be a lot of subjectivity in that, and that's not necessarily helpful to the individual artist. So the reason why I'm going on so long about something like this instead of talking about what's happening in the piece is because you can see how long it's taking to do certain aspects here. When you're doing something like those eyelashes, it takes a lot longer than like the iris that you see me plugging in right there. Or when you're doing the eyelashes, it takes longer than something like the skin, because these are like little bitty details that you're having to make sure you're getting right, making sure those eyelids come off sharp, or at least that's what I wanted them to do. I wanted them to come off as sharp. And so those types of things take a lot more massaging, a lot more adding and erasing and all of that, especially when you're working at certain resolutions and you are sort of like when you're zoomed in, you're just basically looking at pixels at that point, and you have to make some interesting choices. Speaking of interesting, let's look at the layers that are about to get laid down here. We've got actually several chunks of hair. I had it split up into different layers because of how I maybe wanted to treat it with the atmosphere. We've got this clump of hair, which represents the bangs that are sort of cutting across her forehead, and then some of the hair that goes into the back. But then when we get sort of past that grouping that you can kind of see in the line art there, we then switch to new layers that are behind the head and neck layers. And that's just so that we can keep things keep things separate and work with them separately in case we want to. For instance, if I wanted like really heavy atmosphere, it would help me out a lot to be able to say, take that hair and that's in the back clumps and actually knock it back, lower its opacity, or put some paint in between it and her face that is maybe some of the color from the background. And so by making certain smart choices about what you're going to keep separate, you can keep that flexibility. It's a nice day here, so I have the window open and like planes have gone by and the neighbors have been like shouting and dogs have been barking, so I keep having to stop things in the middle of my thought process. These are the hardships we face online doing YouTube videos. But anyways, so now that big bang clump, everything from her bangs to that sort of midpoint is on a layer on top, and then the back hair, all of the back hair now is all on its own layer. I don't think I split that up anymore because there's really no reason to. They don't really touch each other, so I can keep them separate. The only thing I need to make sure of is that the part of it that are the layers on top flow naturally into the parts that's on the bottom, because in some ways we're making like extreme leaps in three-dimensional space, right? We've got this hair that's supposed to just curve back and become part of that hair, but we have sort of like a chasm in between there when you think of it layer wise. It doesn't actually form into the back in reality. They're completely separated. Actually, I may have the layers separate. I think the hair layers behind her head and behind her neck are separate. They're on their own layer, and then the part that's sort of coming down is sort of that mass of hair that falls along the side of her face is separate, because I want to colorize that slightly darker and slightly bluer just to make it have like a stylistic depth to it, because it's a little bit darker. Now, let's think about the design of this character a little bit, since we're having to stare at this hair get painted in so much. The hair color was something I decided on almost immediately. For whatever reason, I didn't even see anybody with this hair color recently. I was just thinking to myself, like, let's have something that goes from like a yellow to a green to a blue type thing. And that was the idea for the hair. And then for the jacket, I just knew that I wanted something that was going to really play off of the hair, and I'm a big fan of pink, and even though the jacket's not pink, it's like a more red, but it certainly is leaning that direction. It's just a color that I love playing with in general. And then the symbols and all of that stuff that are on the jacket, that comes later. I come up with it later. I sort of knew in the middle of it that I was always going to want something, but I just didn't know what it was going to be. By the way, if my recording sounds different, that's because my wife and kids came home, and so I had to escape to a place where there was no noise, and I'm in a slightly more cavernous room, so sorry for the change in audio quality there. This whole illustration has a bit of a fresh vibe to it, so that's why she has like a white plug in her ear and then like a white eyebrow piercing. I just thought it would be nice to have this sort of like fresh, slightly modern thing going on with some of the aspects. Since all the colors are very bright, I just wanted to echo that even there. So everything is sort of considered across the board. The white of the jacket is a slightly different white than those whites on the earring and the eyebrow piercing, or not earring, but the plug, and that's, but they're still in the same vibe, is where I'm going with that. So here you can see we've got the main bulk of the color. I had to reference a lot of Letterman jackets just to understand how they do color. There are some sort of consistencies, but to be honest, they don't stay incredibly consistent when you really get down to it. That was me toying with the idea of doing like yellow sleeves and like a yellow collar, but I end up instead deciding to do like a yellow undershirt. Or not undershirt, it's not a true undershirt, but it's under the jacket. It's like a collared polo shirt. I just thought that would be nice, and it would play off of the other colors that we have going off here pretty well. So, Letterman jackets can have different colored stripes depending on the sleeve or the collar. Like, they can have different things going on. They can have different patches all over them. They can also have different patches within the same school based on what that student has accomplished or whatever. So it's sort of a mixed bag trying to make it accurate. So I just really went with something that felt like it was the right amount of colors, the right amount of color blocking, and then the right amount of patches and everything to make it look like it was legit without it looking overly done or not served enough, basically. Just trying to find that right balance in design. I was going to wait a little bit to talk about Giant Robo, since Giant Robo is the theme of her jacket, but I realized in the middle of looking at sort of what I'm doing with these volumes and stuff that I should start talking about Giant Robo now, because Giant Robo is actually one of my biggest influences, and though I've probably mentioned it in the past, for instance, I did one of the characters from Giant Robo a while ago on this channel, Alberto. I think it's worth sort of highlighting right now how influential that anime is to me. In fact, the volumes that you see me working with here, the way the jacket is, the way her hand is, even her head height and her like head-hand ratio is all driven by Giant Robo. And that wasn't necessarily deliberate. I wasn't sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to make this coat Giant Robo themed, and then I'm going to make her proportions Giant Robo. That's just naturally what I do because I'm influenced by it so much. So if you haven't seen the anime Giant Robo, I highly recommend it. I don't mean the newer one that they did a few years ago. I actually haven't seen that. I hear it's not bad, but the classic is really where to go for it. It's the one that was produced in the 90s, and it's actually about to get a Blu-ray release, so awesome. And it's going to have both dubs. I prefer the original dub because it's super over the top and exaggerated, and I really like that. But anyways, the point is that it's really totally awesome and worth seeing. I think that some of the visual design, I think all of the visual design of that show is some of the best in the world, and I think that the story is super cool, the characters are really cool, it's just all around awesome. And if you watch the first episode, by the way, it has a bit of like a carefree sort of vibe, but then it really changes tone. And I'm not saying that in one of those ways where it's like you think it's for kids but it's really not. Like, that's not what I mean. It's just really interesting how they manage that tone throughout the series. So take a look at it. If you start watching it, you'll see probably where I get a lot of my influence. And that is here. Even the way the shape of the hands are, and the shape of these volumes, as I said. The characters in Giant Robo actually have a pretty high head height. They have small heads and bigger bodies. It's not as extreme maybe as something like Ninja Scroll or something else from that era, but it is bigger than, like, say, a Disney animation. And so it manifests in these shapes, which is funny because then when I end up taking this coat the Giant Robo route, it all ties together in sort of a subtle way. So if you're really familiar with that anime and its look and feel, you can see that in the character, and then it's also represented in the jacket. Now you can see that the way that I've broken up her back hand is I've got her fingers, and then I've got her like palm and thumb as two separate layers. That's just to keep some things separate. Specifically when I'm going through and doing the ambient occlusion pass, it's really nice to have the layers all separate. It's less important when I'm doing the direct shadow. In this piece, which we'll talk about when I get to the lighting, I actually do some slightly different things than what I've done in the past, and that's pretty interesting, I think. Something I'm going to do is soon, I was thinking about this when I was working on my most recent piece, is I'm going to do a bit of a retrospective over the last year or so, where you can see how I've evolved in the last year. And it doesn't mean that I've made like a massive leap. It's not the same type of leap that somebody makes like in their first couple years of learning how to draw or whatever, but I want to sort of demonstrate the thought process behind learning new techniques and applying them, and then how they can sort of mix and match. And I think that'll be interesting. So we'll talk about that in a future video, but I just wanted to sort of highlight that the lighting that I end up using in this is an evolution of previous pieces, and then what you'll see in the pieces after this continues that evolution, and I think it might be cool to talk about how that charts. So now we're going to start the ambient occlusion pass. So you see I've turned the lines on. I've got them there as a bit of a reference. And you can see on her back sleeve where the shadows are starting to be put in. I'm working with a lighter than mid, but not too light, sort of red-brown, and it's set to multiply. And I'm doing select paint, select clear, which is a method that I use to move through my layers and add shadows. That is linked below. Also, some people have asked about if I'm going to do new versions of Select Paint, Select Clear and Fat Pencil and sort of some of those older videos. When Procreate 5 officially releases, I'm going to redo all of those videos, so look forward to that. Oh, I've also been asked when Procreate 5 is coming out because I have access to the beta. I have no idea. They're not communicating that. I'm sure it's going to come out when it's ready, and they're working on it, and they want to make sure that it's good. So it's coming. They've said before the end of the year, but I have no knowledge beyond what they've publicly announced to everyone. So the ambient occlusion pass is being applied right here. I'm basically painting it in, and I'm smudging it out. I'm using the turpentine brush top to bottom for basically the entirety of this piece. I can't think of exactly where I change it. I may somewhere, but I can't remember. But it's turpentine brush from top to bottom. Turpentine brush for smudge, turpentine brush for eraser, turpentine brush for paintbrush. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to add shadow around the deepest recesses where the light doesn't hit, but the reason why I'm always hesitant to call what I'm doing here exclusively ambient occlusion pass is because I do a little bit more than just strictly AO. I also do some just sort of surface definition here or there. Basically whatever I feel is the right information that I need to communicate the form. So that's what I'm doing here on the hand, and as I move through these layers, you're going to see me adding it a little bit darker in the darkest recesses, like by where the fingers, underneath the fingers there, where they cast like a little bit of a soft shadow onto the hand, and it separates the forms, and places where places where light can't reach is the darkest, and then it's just really soft gradient out from there, or as much as possible. An AO pass could be much softer than what I do here, but I'm using the turpentine brush on purpose to make it rougher so that I can't get it too soft. Every now and then that'll frustrate me, and you might see me just quickly, soften it with an eraser or something like that, but for let's say 99% of this, it's all done that way so that we can keep a little bit of that handmade look to it and it doesn't look too artificial. You can see here in the hair, we're using it a little bit less as an AO, and we're using it also to define those strands of hair. You could make the reasonable argument that light wouldn't really get into those cracks super well, so it's still accurate AO to some degree. Maybe that's true, but that's really not, I think it would still manifest slightly differently. And so I'm in there just trying to make sure that that hair has actual shape to it within that bigger shape, so we can see the individual it's not really strands, but sort of clumps of volume that are swirling through there. Now, since you saw sort of how the flats got laid in, you can start understanding where I'm at in this process based on what part of it I'm actually working on. Since I'm working on those little hairs behind her neck and now moving up to the hairs behind her head, that means next we'll be getting to things like her neck, and then like her, actually probably face after that, but like then like shirt and jacket and front sleeve and front hand and all that kind of stuff. So now we've cleared away her face and we're starting to work on the shadows where the hair overlaps the face. We're going to try and separate that ear from the back of her skull just to get some more depth out of that. We're going to push the nose forward by putting a shadow on the distant side of the nose. And so some of these are observed actual ways to represent them, and others are design based. Not everything that I do is trying to make something realistic. I mean, obviously the proportions of the design, but I mean even the rendering style. Sometimes you break reality for the purpose of design, for the purpose of clarity, or for the purpose of style, something like that. And so you'll see that every now and then. We're going to move through this face. We're going to add definition to the ear, definition to the mouth, the rest of the nose. You can see right there we're putting the slight little bag under the eye. It's not really a bag, but just trying to define that underside of the eyelid. And then we'll move into her eyes and earring and beyond. Now that the face is done and we're onto the top hair, you see we're adding in all those strands. You can see very lightly in the sketch that there's sort of like a stray grouping of hair that I did not put in the flat, so now I'm going to go ahead and put that in, which means I'm then going to also clear away the shadow work that was put in so that I can now respect that new strand of hair that's been added. The good news is, since that layer is added on top, it still follows the select paint, select clear method. So I just put it on top of the layers, I paint it in exactly where I want it, and then I select it and clear the shadows, like right there, and then I just use it as a selection and I start painting in the same spot. So it's when you insert it in the middle of the process, or if you insert it in late but there's no other layers on top of it, it's really easy to just add it in and then start putting in the new shadows for that new piece. In a minute, we're going to move on to the coat, and then we'll get into like the bigger chunk of things, and then we'll come back and start commenting on the new design stuff that gets added to the coat. Sometimes when I'm in the flatting process, I get a little impatient and I want to move into the paints, and that's okay sometimes. And a new method that I've been using is I've been just trying to keep track of when that's okay and when that's not. In this case, it was okay to go ahead and move into the paints without that strand of hair and without these buttons on the jacket, because I knew I'd be able to add them in later and it wouldn't be a big deal. Something like the insignia that I end up sticking on her jacket, that's actually something that's a little bit more like, okay, I should have taken that into account a little bit sooner, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that, and that was more of just like a, I don't know, we'll get to it later type thing, as opposed to more of a strategic, I'll do the buttons when I get to that part. So that's what we do there. We introduce these buttons onto, their snaps, onto her coat, and we will come in and add the patches and all that kind of stuff later. But right now we're just going in and doing select paint, select clear across the coat and across those new buttons and stuff that got, new snaps that got added. should mention that the reason why the background is gray right now is because when I was in the middle of doing the skin earlier, it was too close to the background color, so I needed the gray so that I could see that more clearly. Now that we're done with that first shadow pass, it's not that big of a deal to turn it back to pink because now there's some definition there. We can start working on the direct shadow now, which is the shadow I use for the cast shadows. In this one, what I did specifically was I tried to keep track of any object. If I sort of think of all of her layers as different objects, which objects would cast light onto the next object. And that was actually the only, if I remember correctly, the only way that I then did my direct shadow this time. I didn't use my direct shadow to establish form because what I was going for was a little bit of that sort of fashion photography where the light's not coming from like the top right and casting down or some sort of either logical or dramatic light. It's more of just a straight on light casting her against a backdrop, and that's all we've got going on there. So that can be a really tricky lighting to do, and I think that I sometimes do it and it works, and I sometimes do it and it doesn't work. I think it worked here, but I think that it can be tricky. I remember very early in my career when I was posting on like conceptart.org or something in like 2003 that someone actually critiqued something I had done by saying that I didn't have a strong light source. It looked like the character was being lit from the front, and that is a bad way to light a character. What that person was, I think, actually getting at was that I wasn't pulling it off. I wasn't even trying to really do like a front light. I was trying to just paint. I was like desperately just trying to figure out Photoshop because I didn't even start teaching myself Photoshop until early 2003. So at the time, I was just like, I don't know, man, I'm just trying to do whatever. So I think really what the person was saying was, yeah, maybe it can be hard. It's not necessarily a bad way to light a character. You just have to do it right. And really that's true with any lighting. You want to try and do it right. It's just that one feels a little tricky sometimes because it's really hard to sell depth if you can't see the dark side of something and have the core shadow and then have the bounce light. So what I'm trying to do here, success varying, I mean it's all about opinion, right? But I think I did a decent job, is trying to get that direct light. She's lit from the front, or more or less the front. It's like front slightly up, slightly right. And then it's casting, like for instance, her face and neck against her hair, her jacket against her back arm, and then ultimately we'll have her whole form cast against the background. This is a lighting that I've just kind of been playing around with a lot lately, and I have a little fun with it. And we're going to obviously change that up. In fact, I've got another piece coming out soon that we sort of take like a step back to a completely different style just to keep things fresh. But this is sort of, when I think about like the pieces that are just for me, or I shouldn't say just for me, but are targeting more what I want, this falls into that category, and some of the other recent stuff I've done I've been really passionate about. But obviously light changes all the time. Lighting changes all the time. You always have to practice different lighting setups. In fact, I would argue that one that I don't play with nearly enough is someone lit from the bottom. But in general, this has just been a fun thing to experiment with, and I'm going to keep doing it for a bit, but we're going to pepper in some other stuff. I actually just completed a piece of Cyborg Ninja from Metal Gear Solid 1 that I think y'all are going to dig. So, and that uses some sort of older methodologies and mixes a couple of new stuff in. In fact, that one's going to have a bit of a Photoshop tutorial in it. So, ooh, there's a tease. People have been asking me to do Photoshop stuff in here for a while. It's obviously just much harder for me to produce, but we're gonna do at least like a little bit of Photoshop tricky stuff in that one. So look forward to that. It's like 5 videos from now, which means it's like a month and a half away, but you know, we'll get there eventually. So what stage are we at here? I was kind of looking into the distance as I was recording that last bit. So we've got our direct shadow is starting to be applied everywhere. She's lit from more or less the front, a little top right, but more or less the front. We're going to be going through, this is using the same shadow color as the ambient occlusion pass. However, I think I tweak them a little bit as things go on. So we'll just keep an eye out for that, but that's irrelevant really, because anybody, once you've got your shadow layers in, you can tweak them and sort of make adjustments based on your own preferences. Okay, we're getting into lighting, and I mean the whole thing is lighting, but I mean the light source color layers. These, I believe on this one, are set to like an overlay as opposed to just being normal. So it turns out that was a goddamn lie. I just checked the file, they're just set to normal, although I think you may see them flicker and blink in here because I do remember testing different things at different times, but anyways, they are normal at the end of it. It's a very light blue with a slightly towards green, and that's what I'm using as my light source throughout this. You can see it being very lightly applied, so sometimes it really depends on the piece and how something is lit. I will sometimes do my select paint, select clear method when I'm doing the lighting. However, since when I'm working like this, everything is already keyed pretty high. We've got the shadows in there to bring all the shadow work in, but it doesn't take that much to get the highlights before everything starts getting too lit, basically. It's almost like something being kind of overexposed. So instead of going through it systematically and like addressing every layer, I just kind of go through and pepper it where it feels natural. Her skin feels like it would pick up the light. Maybe her sleeve would a little bit if it's like leather. Maybe her nails definitely would, and her eyeballs and her hair definitely would. And so those are the areas that I try to focus on the most, and then I don't really put anything in on something that's not very reflective. Here on the hair, I'm doing one layer of the blue that's at the same opacity as the skin and everything else, and that's the sort of fatter part of the shine, and then the more intense part of the shine is on a new layer applied again with its opacity adjusted as well. There's going to be a lot of little things that happen here now. You're going to get some reflection on the eyeballs in a second. I'm also going to put in a little bit of subsurface scattering on the ears and the hands. It's not really true subsurface scattering, like there's a light passing through it. It's more about just adding like a little bit of luminance in those areas to make them feel a little more fleshy and a little bit more dynamic. It's kind of hard to explain. Let's just say that it's one of those art things that just kind of feels right, even though it may not have substantial backing logically. There's also some things like the hot sort of outline around the shadows that's going to happen. You'll see it flip in there real quick, and then it gets lowered in opacity, so that's just there. And these are all just like a lot of little adjustments that are hitting right now before we get into some other bigger things down the line with more bounce and things like that. So we're about to enter an area right here where I've turned off all the flats because I wanted to be able to see these highlights on the sleeve really well. They're really subtle, but they matter, but it's one of those things that when you're in the middle of putting them in, it's kind of hard to determine whether or not you're putting them in right because the values are so close. Now, I've slowed this way down just so I can talk about this here. Here you can see all of the layers that I'm using for lighting without the colors affecting them. You can see the forms and how they read. You can see how even at like this, the eyes feel glassy, the skin feels a little bit more matte, the hair feels like it's in between those two. You can see that the ear feels a little bit more fleshy because it's got that pink there. And this is sort of a good way to just see that, like, how even at this reduced stage, you can start feeling how these materials actually are without all of the colors underneath them. I know there's lots of people who maybe release a version of their illustration where they've like desaturated or unified all the flats so that you can see something like this. I don't do that very often, but here's a really good way that you can see it for a second. So we're getting done with putting the highlights in the sleeve, and so in a second, when the flats all get turned back on again, you can see that it adds a little bit of extra dimension to that sleeve. Which is just nice. And the blue wasn't going to be able to do that because the blue is too low. It's too close, let's put it that way, in value to the sleeve. So now since we're using pure white, we can really pop that sleeve right there. So it's really subtle, you see it right there, but it's there. And that sort of registers in your brain as the depth of that particular part. So for the next section, I'm actually going to speed things up a little bit. There's going to be lots of little tweaks that are all going to go by, but they're actually, I mean, I won't say they're insignificant because they eventually add up to the whole of the image, but they're really minor, and I'm just going to bring them all through really quickly, and then I'll come back in a second when we get to doing the patches on her jacket. Everything that was done, there were things like bloom on the sleeve, putting the shadow in that's cast behind her and fuzzing it up a bit, putting that stylistic yellow line around her, a bunch of little things like that. If you go back through that last section on your own at full resolution, I'm sure you can pick out everything that was there and understand sort of how it was done in general. So now we're at the part where we're adding the patch. So this first patch on her shoulder is the title character from Giant Robo. It is Giant Robo himself. And then on her chest, we're going to put a GR for Giant Robo. And then on her back, we will put something to indicate that there is a big patch on her back as well. So here we've got Giant Robo. I'm just basically laying him in. He's really simplified on purpose. This is a patch after all. He would be simplified. In the illustration, he's also a very, very small detail. So I want it to be something that reads clearly for those who know what it is, but that it is representative of how simple the patch would be, as well as not, overly detailed to make it look like it was created differently from the rest of the illustration. I should have used the symmetry tool for this, but I instead just did it by hand because I'm a dum-dum. But anyways, it makes it more handmade, let's call it that. So now we're just finishing up Giant Robo here. We'll position his patch so that it looks like it's more on her sleeve in the right way in a second. And then we'll go and we'll eventually add shadows to it as well. Now, I actually didn't reference patches when I did this. I probably should have, but I already sort of knew kind of how I wanted it to look. That one wasn't something that I need to reference too much. I did want to kind of reference the patches, though, from the letters on the GR on her chest, and as I said before, I referenced these types of jackets in general, so I had what I needed, sort of. I did shadow this, though, before I positioned it, which was kind of stupid, but we recover, which is good. You see I'm adding just a little bit more detail in there to make sure he's defined and not too flat. Patches do have a little bit of definition from sort of thread color to thread color, and depending on how they make it, so that's that. Now here I was trying to find what was already in Procreate, a fairly collegiate font. This is not super collegiate, but it's close enough, and once we add all the effects and layout and all that kind of stuff to it, it'll be fine. So this logo as it is not a logo that already appears in Giant Robo. I just sort of made it up. Once I found the font that I needed, I positioned the letters the way that I thought looked cool, and then I went in there with the turpentine brush and repainted over them a bit to get them looking like they're in the spirit of the entire piece. I'm also referencing Letterman jackets and how these letters generally look, so that I can try and make it look as on point as possible. Now, one thing that I didn't do well enough when I first did it was try to capture the layering that happens, because these are usually really dimensional letters. So I could have done it in a way that was more organized and got the look and feel that I wanted more easily, but it's fine. We do recover and we get it looking exactly how I want it to. It's just one of those bad planning things. I've said it in previous videos, so much of art is about planning. Yes, it's true that there's lots of art that's reactive, but when you have a very specific goal, you know how to get there. It's more of a, I've done this before, I got to do it again type of a thing. A lot of it is around problem solving and planning, and that's really how you become an efficient artist, especially one who works professionally in the modern age, right? So you can see here, the big thing that I'm concerned with is making sure I get these thicknesses right. I know that I'm about to distort this in order to fit the angle of the front of the coat. So I have to make sure, or jacket, so I have to make sure that I've got enough thickness here so that it'll read once it gets distorted and everything. So I'm just sort of playing with that at this stage, trying to get this logo to be where I want it to be. Be where I want it to be. That would be the entire sentence if I was good at speaking. So you can see here, we've got a little bit of duplicating of layers and things like that, and now we've positioned it where we want it to be. So what I do here first is I actually totally fuck it up, and I don't do it well. I think, rushing. I wanted this piece to look really nice, but at this point I was just kind of impatient, and I put it together and I was like, gosh, this is just a mess. I did not do this the way that I wanted to do it. So in a second you're going to see me sort of readdress it and actually fix all of my problems. So what happened was when I warped it into place, I should have warped them as different layers, and then I could adjust those layers to give them the height that they need to look like they're actually in perspective. I kind of wasn't thinking right. I did that with the red and the blue are on their own layers, and then the white was separate. So I did it with that, but I didn't do it with anything else. So now here what I'm doing is I'm manually going in and painting in that depth by having that red of the G on the back side of it actually go beyond the blue so that it looks like it is thick, and I'm basically going through all of it and trying to do that, trying to choose where that should happen. And so that's what's happening right now. It's really subtle. You can see I also turned off the shadows again because I have to readdress the shadows once I'm done with that. So the long short of this explanation is when I warped it too flat, and I didn't take into account its depth. Even though that was on my mind, I just did it wrong. And then I was like, oh shit, okay. And so I came in here and I'm having to readdress that problem and fix it. So we're going to see a new pass in the shadows on it in a second as well. And then you'll see when I do the patch on the back, it's very on my mind, and I do it correctly with that because I'm thinking more about it. That's something that is really important about art in general, is there's a lot of things that if you draw it for the first time ever, you're not going to know how to do it. You're not going to do it right. This wouldn't be one of those. This would be more of an example of me just being an idiot and doing it wrong. But that's sort of like the trial and error, is you find the right ways to do things over time, and then it just goes into your bag of tricks, and you can do it better in the future. So in a second, we're going to be done with this sort of redux of the GR on here. If you scroll back to when it sort of like first got into place, and then you scroll to the end of where this section is going to end, you're going to see, I think, a big difference between the two. And as I said, now that back patch is going on, you're going to see it almost immediately have the proper depth on it because I'm thinking about it in a much smarter way. Now we are right in the middle of the last touches apocalypse that happens in every time lapse, where you're going through and you're making sure all your little values are correct and you're making sure things are standing out the way you want them to. Maybe you're adding some stylistic elements here or there. Maybe you're adding some last minute textures or trying to make sure that your colors are exactly what you want them to be for the color scheme. And that's why you see on these time lapses like a million things happening at the end really fast. So that's where we are now. My big concern with this, just where my head's at, is I've put it together. I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. I like the fact that I got to roll in this giant Robo thing. I like the fact that it's like stylistically influenced by it and then also represented on the coat. So now I'm just trying to make sure that, like, you know, you, in some ways you only kind of get like one shot at posting this and having people feel what you feel when you created it. So I'm just trying to make sure every last touch is there. Are my shadows too dark? Are they too light? Are they right where they're supposed to be? And that's why you're seeing all this toggling happen. Sometimes too, because of the nature of the time lapse, I might be showing somebody that I work with, or showing my kid, or showing just someone the file, and I'm turning things on and off, and sometimes that gets captured in the time lapse. So now we're adding just a little bit of dark shadow on the distant side of her face because I wanted that to round off a little bit more. I know that it's not fully fleshed out, but that was what I wanted to do, to just give a little bit more roundness to that without getting into actually like rendering it up and putting like a really hard shadow there. Also, at the very end here, I made a ton of hand adjustments on this one hand right here. I showed the piece to Renato, who was the person who did that guest video on this channel, and he gave me some feedback around the hand, so I started working on it a little bit more. I liked the fact that the hand was stylized, but I thought that he was right, that there were aspects of it that could have read better, so I pulled her index finger out a little bit more to put some definition in there. I smooth out her palm, because it was reading, as Renato put it, too much like the heel of a foot, kind of. So I just smoothed that out a little bit. I like a nice voluminous palm, but just wanted to get that a little rounded out, and then adjust the shadows and everything so that it all makes sense with it. That was all just done as a single layer paint over at the very end. So now, last minute touches, all the layers are on, good to go, and this right here is the final piece. So I hope you enjoy the piece. I hope you enjoy seeing the breakdown of it. I personally am just really happy with the way it came out. Some pieces are just kind of like that. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions about it or how it was created, please let me know in the comments below. I basically always respond to everyone, so see you in the comments. Also, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It does help the channel grow, and I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.